world. I think that actually one of the misconceptions that have had the biggest impact on the shape of world history from the late 90s onwards is the illusion that Afghanistan is not important. We don't believe that the West will react with tight sanctions, with support for Ukraine, with so on. They'll let us get away with it. This region of the world, before it was called Afghanistan, it's been at the center of the Silk Roads. I think Zaire was much more cautious about it, and I think he had a sense that this will cause more trouble than it's worth. The Americans were, they provided some development aid, and we're happy to kind of have Afghanistan as a kind of a friend, but they were extremely reluctant about the military aid, because they were like, well, he's so popular, he'll just win, and then we'll go back to just being the royal family ruling everything. So after Dawood takes over in 1973, he kind of has two extreme threats. He has the communists on one side, and he has kind of allied with and he's allied with some of the moderate communists in the army, and then he has the extreme Islamists on the other side. In 1978, there's a series of events where one of the main kind of ideologues in the Communist Party gets murdered. It's still unknown who did it. It could have been another communist, it could have been Dawood, it could have been the Islamists. There's reason to kind of have suspicion for everyone.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Time Slow Podcast. Today we have with us Mr. Stephen Jensen. Mr. Stephen Jensen is a London-based management consultant and a war veteran who served in Afghanistan and Mali. Thank you so much, Stephen, for your time. You're welcome on our show.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
How are you doing, Stephen?
Good. The weather is good here in London for about 2 weeks every year, and this is one of those weeks. So we are enjoying it and trying to make the most out of the summer.
Oh, great! First of all, Stephen, tell our audience about yourself.
Yeah, so my name is Stefan Jensen. I'm originally from Norway. I had my previous career. I spent about 5 years in the Norwegian military, with some time in Afghanistan as well as in Mali. About 10 years ago, and then since then I became a civilian. I'm now living in London, working with entirely different things. But since about 2 years ago, I've been working on a history of the war in Afghanistan, which I started writing in advance of the withdrawal. And that book aims to kind of do two things. Firstly, I want to pull back the timeline, as it were, on the war in Afghanistan to get out of this view of thinking that everything started in 2001 with 9/11 and everything before that is kind of myth and legend. But really, it's a longer conflict that has much deeper roots and should be seen in that context. And then secondly, to get away from the idea that the war in Afghanistan primarily is about us, however you define us. I mean, if you go to Norway, there are lots of books about Norway's war in Afghanistan, and those are important, of course, in the Norwegian context, right? And if you're in Britain or if you're in America or whatever, right, it'll kind of be about America's war, Britain's war, France's war, or whatever. But I think they call it the more comprehensive view of the war in Afghanistan, which also I think put Afghanistan as a country in the kind of in the position of main character, as it were. That story is less told, especially outside of kind of academic literature and so on. So that's the project I'm working on, the book. And then as a kind of byproduct of that, I've been writing more and more sort of little snippets of the arguments and the story I'm telling on Twitter, where I'm very pleased to see that actually some people want to read it, which was a welcome surprise.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Actually, Stephen, we would discuss on Afghanistan wars. We may do another episode of Afghan wars or conflicts in Afghanistan. That would be before 1978. That your book is focused on 1978 to 2001. So that your upcoming book. I would say.
So,
So
2020, 2021. It's a little bit of a misnomer because I actually writing from 1953, but I define the war as being from kind of 78.
So you're writing from 1950. The history would be included from 1953 to onwards, right? But you
Yes,
have
yes,
given it the
exactly.
title 1973 or 4 to onwards, right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
this would be our topic of discussion. Uh, why did you choose Afghanistan? Actually, you were in. This may be a naive question, but I just wanted to know your view that why did you choose Afghanistan? Do you think that Afghanistan has become irrelevant to the world, and you want to work on that?
I mean, I absolutely don't think it's relevant to the world. I think that actually one of the misconceptions that have had the biggest impact on the shape of world history from the late 90s onwards is the illusion that Afghanistan is not important. I think if we had not suffered from this illusion, then catastrophes like 9/11 might have been avoided. Certainly, the failure in the end of the Western intervention, I think, would have been avoided, and I think an enormous amount of suffering in Afghanistan would have been avoided. But to answer your question about why Afghanistan, I mean, obviously, I have a bit of a personal connection. I spent some time in Afghanistan with the military. I luckily had a very peaceful mission, as it were. You described me as a war veteran, and of course, I was in the war, but mostly, it was a time and a place in Afghanistan, in northern Afghanistan, when security was quite good. I spent time as an advisor to the Afghan forces, and we had lots of interesting. We did lots of interesting work together, and but I went my entire mission without firing a single shot or getting shot at, for that matter. But the time spent not just in Afghanistan but also preparing for Afghanistan, I've left a deep mark on me. But I think also more than that, I think Afghanistan has left a much deeper impact on the world than we realize. I think in some ways, Afghanistan, the war in Afghanistan, the long war in Afghanistan, starting in the 70s, it was at the center of the end of the Cold War. You could argue that it was the kind of final piece of the puzzle that maybe led to the kind of the final drop that led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, contribute to that. Afterwards, when it was kind of forgotten by the world, it became a home to radical Islamist terrorism, Al Qaeda, and so on. Led to a lot of insecurity in the region, but also terrorist attacks several terrorist attacks leading up to 9/11, and then afterwards it became the kind of opening shot in the Great War on Terror, which I think lots have been written about this, about called it the successes and failures of the Great War on Terror, but certainly some major failures like the decision to invade Iraq was a result of kind of multiple third degree consequences of previous disengagement from Afghanistan, in a way. From allowing Al Qaeda to grow, from then having a kind of overreaction after 2001, from imagining connections that weren't there, and so on. But then even later, in terms of the both very direct things, like the refugee crisis that came from the kind of destabilization of the Middle East and so on, had huge effect on Europe. Brexit, for example, and other things. But also, I think a sort of a loss of confidence in the global world order, as it were, is also direct consequence, both a direct consequence and an indirect consequence of the war in Afghanistan, and in a way the effort to pretend that it's unimportant. I think you could argue, it's difficult to prove, but you could argue, for example, that the boldness of President Putin in invading Ukraine, and for the first time in a long time starting a large-scale conventional war in Europe, would not have happened if Afghanistan had ended differently, with a more without the kind of a clear defeat, but also a self-perception, I think, on the part of the West and on the part of NATO, that of kind of impotence and a loss of faith in ourselves. So I think it's had enormous consequences on the world, the war in Afghanistan, and consequences that have kind of gone almost undetected. Because people, and so for me, I think
Stephen, how are you relating Afghanistan to Ukraine, the war in Ukraine? I couldn't understand that.
Well, I think the reason why someone like Putin, or I mean, it's not just Putin, right, but China as well, when they say, well, actually, we think we can get away with this now because clearly, we don't believe that the West will react with tight sanctions, with support for Ukraine, with so on. They'll let us get away with it, essentially.
So the West has weakened, and we can go ahead with that.
Exactly, right. So there's I think that perception was entirely reasonable. That's an assessment that was entirely reasonable to make in August 2021, right? When an ally, a close ally of the United States and the West, was kind of left to defeat and betrayed. And I would argue it was a kind of betrayal. And it relates to China
or the Afghanistan.
Say again.
Betrayed the NATO forces or Afghanistan?
No, I think there was betrayal of the Afghan forces, and we can get back to that. But I think, I mean, you had a lot of very, very, very committed Afghan forces, especially the special forces and so on, who fought for years and years and years, believing that they had the backing of the West and the backing of the United States. And this, post 2014, this was a war fought with Western materiel and Afghan sweat and blood, by and large, right? And then after 2021, the kind of the political support and the materiel and was kind of pulled away, and this created a crisis that led to the collapse. And we can discuss this in more detail, but I think that sends a very strong signal globally, right? So immediately after the collapse of Afghanistan and the victory of the Taliban, one of the first things that happened in China daily is that the Chinese Communist Party start talking about how obviously the United States is not a reliable ally for Taiwan, right? So these are kind of connections that I think it's easy to think, oh well, what does it matter? Afghanistan is far away, but actually, these types of decisions, these types of defeat, maybe, I would argue kind of a self-imposed defeat, have huge consequences geopolitically, and it's had that before in different ways.
All right. Okay.
Yeah. Anyway,
okay,
sorry, that was a long answer to your short question.
Yeah, it was a lengthy answer, but it was detailed. Obviously your view has backings. I would like to take you to 1953 onwards and 1953. And why do you think 1953 was important? And it led to the series of events and which ended in 1978 and the Soviet War and Soviets also the Soviets lost and Soviet Union disintegrated. So just why is 1953 important for you?
Yeah. So 1953 is the year that Mohammed Dawood, who later takes power in a coup from King Zahir.
He was the prime minister of Zahir Shah.
He was the prime minister, exactly. He becomes the prime minister in that year. And in some ways, him becoming prime minister was a kind of a generational shift within the regime of Afghanistan at the time, because obviously Zahir Shah, who turned out to become the longest ruling king in Afghanistan, he, or at least in sort of modern times, he came to power in 1933 as a young 19-year-old after his father was killed and was clearly too young to rule. And so but rather than his uncles, I think wisely, his uncles, instead of kind of fighting among themselves for who should be king instead of him, they let him be king, and then they ruled as prime minister on his behalf. And he was kind of, I think he got a bit of a reputation for kind of being a laid-back guy who, spent a lot of time going on holiday and so on. But clearly he was spending a lot of time kind of learning how to be king and learning how to rule his country. And then in 1953, his cousin, who was sort of of the same generation as King Zahir, Dawood, was made prime minister. Some people describe that as a kind of a palace coup. I don't know if that's the right description, but it was clearly changing of the guard in a way. But what they wanted, both Dawood and King Zahir, who he was ruling on behalf of, was really to accelerate the modernization of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And for good reasons, right? This was in 1953. This was still a very poor country, a lot of suffering because of that poverty. Depending on which statistics you read, the rate of young children dying before age of 5 might have been as high as 25%. A lot of preventable disease, very vulnerable to famine when the harvests were going wrong, and all these kinds of things. So there's clearly a kind of a push to relieve some of that suffering by modernizing and promoting economic development and so on. And then also Dawood and Zahir themselves were also, they had been educated in Europe. They were, at least in the kind of Afghan context, liberals, I'd say. You can use that word with, you should be careful about kind of using these labels in a kind of universal way, but they were clearly kind of progressives in that context, and wanted to I think for kind of personal, as a personal,
they were
logical mission.
For against, they were
absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And so I think they had a very clear ambition to kind of make Afghanistan great again. If you look in the deep history, right, this region of the world before it was called Afghanistan, it's been at the center of the Silk Roads. It's been a center of global commerce, of global exchange of ideas. Every major religion has kind of passed through Afghanistan at some point. That's why I have the Buddha statues that were blown up by the Taliban in 2001. Zoroaster, the kind of monotheist, came from Balkh, or at least according to in the Iranian kind of myths, Balkh is the first city. Right, it's the kind of the foundation of urban civilization, right? Which is kind of the extreme opposite of how I think a lot of people tend to see Afghanistan today, as kind of isolated and rural and old-fashioned. But I think in the old history of it, there's a sense of cosmopolitanism and modernity, or whatever you might have kind of certainly development and sophistication and urban civilization of art. Herat was a great center of Islamic miniature painting, for example. And trade, right? But obviously, in the hundreds of years before the 1900s, I think Afghanistan kind of went from being called a crossroads of the world to being a kind of a back alley of the world, because commerce increasingly came on the sea. The Silk Roads were less and less important. And on-land commerce was more by train and so on. And so when you get to the point where, the Mughal Empire and the Persian Empire is replaced by the British Empire and another Persian Empire, Afghanistan is kind of, and the Russian Empire to the north, Afghanistan becomes becomes the back alley that you want to close off, and you want to make sure there's some guards there, but you don't care about, the back alley itself. It's a very, very different kind of, and so I think, when you get to the 1900s, this generation of Afghan leaders, and it's not a radical shift, right? The kings before them wanted the same thing, but they thought, okay, we'll accelerate this. I think they thought of it as unnatural for Afghanistan to be isolated and underdeveloped and impoverished. And they said, they looked around the world and said, why should Kabul be any less prosperous than Paris, and so, but obviously, and then I think there's another, so that's a hugely important kind of motivation, and then I think there's another motivation that's a bit more, or a lot more contested, which has to do with the kind of the development of Afghanistan as a nation state. What does it mean for Afghanistan to be a nation? And you see that very much contested even today. I think exacerbated by the very painful experiences of the last 40 years. where on the one hand there is a kind of a civic sense of nationalism, which is sort of everyone within these borders are Afghan, and on the other side there is a sort of a more Pashtun-centric nationalism.
This is the same problem as with the Pakistan. This is the same problem with the
exactly. And obviously even the word Afghan and Afghanistan is contested for these reasons, right? Because the exact borders and so on, they're a legacy of different wars and empires and colonial legacy and all these different things. Now, I mean, that might be said for every country. I mean, you could say that the formation of England is a result of the Viking invasions of the 9th century. You can make a good argument for that, right? But in any case, there is a kind of an internal tension between these two ideas, between the sense that Afghanistan is the civic nationalism and the kind of more ethno-nationalism, and that ethno-nationalist idea is very tied to then irredent or claims on what was first British India and then became Pakistan. That is mostly the former Northwest Frontier province and parts of Balochistan and so on. And obviously you can make an argument that makes sense about that, right? You can say, well, this just the British just drew a line here, and why should we listen to that? You can also make an argument that borders are where they are, and let's make do, and or you can make an argument that it wasn't about kind of internal ethnic conflicts within Afghanistan rather than about a sense of nation. I don't want to make a judgment on that partly because it's so contested even today. But I think the historical reality is that because of that conflict between some rulers of Afghanistan, Dawood in particular was very excited about this idea of a kind of a greater Afghanistan, including the Pashtun majority areas of what is now Pakistan. That created conflict. King Zahir was much more relaxed about that, and in the end, one of the reasons why Dawood became kicked out as prime minister after a decade was because that conflict created so much problems for Afghanistan. I mean, and those problems are kind of there whether you think it was justified.
Because the trade routes were closed.
Exactly.
To Pakistan was closed, and there were different issues. Actually, Afghans were facing problems economically, and then this happened. So they threw Dawood because his policies were not aligned with the Zahir Shah's.
Yeah, or I think maybe his ideals were not aligned. I mean, Zahir Shah was was quite hands off, right? So there's but in any case, he for Dawood this was, and for many others in the elite, this was a big priority. I mean, I think he would have seen it in the same way as I mean, you can make it similar to kind of Kashmir, and in Pakistan, right? Where for some, for some in the that's a no, it's a non-negotiable, right? Whereas I think Zahir was much more cautious about it, and I think he had a sense that this will cause more trouble than it's worth. But I don't know what was in their minds. But clearly Dawood was very, very, very keen on this idea.
Hardliner. He was a hardliner.
Absolutely, he was a hardliner. And the result of that was that had a lot of unpredictable results, because in the 1950s, the other thing two things have happened very recently. The first thing is that Pakistan has come into existence, right? I mean, now we think of it, it's always been there, but I mean, at least if you're not, well versed in history, but I mean, at this point, it's a 5-year-old country.
We haven't been there.
Exactly. It's a brand new country. No one knows whether it will still be there in 10 years. No one knows. It's locked into this very dark conflict with India. All the kind of bloody tragedy of partition is fresh in everyone's minds, and that's one thing that's happened, right?
Yes, we have had border issues with China.
Exactly. But that also kind of disrupts the situation very much for or it changes the geopolitical logic for Afghanistan, right? Because they've had this very close relationship with British India, where they have, in the minds of some of the nationalists who've been dreaming about getting the, making the Northwest Frontier province part of Afghanistan, that has never been a reality, a real option, because British India, part of the British Empire, was always so much stronger that it was kind of, you could imagine it, but you couldn't really do anything about it, right? So they have this very tight relationship with British India in terms of trade, in terms of cultural exchange, in terms of, and in many ways that continues up until today, right? Bollywood films are still very popular in Afghanistan, right? But then once you have the partition of India and Pakistan, that also disrupts that relationship, and because Afghanistan kind of starts out in conflict with Pakistan, and India starts out in conflict with Pakistan, India and Afghanistan kind of become de facto allies.
Yeah,
and that's a bigger problem because the Indian constitution at that time, India kind of presented itself as a socialist state, not fully in the communist bloc, but sort of softly in the communist bloc.
They were Russian allies. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And that connects to the other big development that happened in the late 1940s and early 1950s, which is the emergence of the Cold War. So these kind of border conflicts between Afghanistan and Pakistan and India, they become part of the Cold War by extension, right? Because the United States is looking for, they want an ally in the region. India is allied to the Soviet Union. So the Americans go to Pakistan and say, okay, great, you'll be the bulwark of liberal capitalism in this part of the world. We'll support you militarily.
And we were in the need, economic need. We wanted weapons.
Yeah. Exactly.
We were a newborn state, so we need help.
Exactly. I mean, Pakistan at that point was very, very fragile state. And I'm not an expert on Pakistan, but I think that's undisputed. So the partnership with the United States, the alliance with the United States at that point is very welcome. Afghanistan at that point, interestingly, was, I think, was clearly ideologically much more aligned with the United States and with the West. And you can see that in the way that the leaders talk about it. They were educated in the West. They spoke very warmly about the United States. They were even kind of imagining that the kind of anti-colonial attitudes in the United States at that point would kind of protect Afghanistan. So they went a number of times to the Americans, basically say, we need your help for economic support, but also to rebuild our military, to modernize our military. The Americans were, they provided some development aid, and we're happy to kind of have Afghanistan as a kind of a friend, but they were extremely reluctant about the military, because they were like, well, you're in a permanent conflict with Pakistan as long as you don't resolve this border issue. So if you abandon the claims, you say, we're fine, whatever the border is, it's a border, we don't care about this, then we can talk, the Americans said, right? But as long as you want to reunite this, or unite or reunite, depending on your perspective, these bits of land, we're much more worried that you will, if we give you weapons, you're just going to use them against our ally Pakistan. And so what the Afghan government did was and this was spearheaded by Dawood especially, said, well, if the Americans aren't going to help us, let's go to our other neighbor, the Soviet Union. And the Soviets were, of course, very, very happy to help. Or Khrushchev talks about this in his memoirs. He's like, this is fantastic. We saved so much money by not having to have lots of bases on there. We could just give them lots of aid, and suddenly we have an ally, and who knows, maybe at some point it will have other consequences, which of course it did. Because what happens then is the Soviet Union says, absolutely, we'll help you build a modern military, but of course, if you're going to fly our jet fighters and drive our tanks and use our weapons and all those kind of things, you have to send people to the Soviet Union. You have to send your military officers to the Soviet Union to go to
the training purposes,
training and all, and then predictably, quite a lot of them come back as communists. So this is it's a very kind of dangerous thing at the time as well in Afghanistan. So I mean, at the time in Afghanistan, they were conscious of this, right? Dawood was conscious of this. They said this is a gamble, but we think it's important.
This might happen. This might happen.
Yeah, exactly. We'll avoid it. We'll take this risk. It's a calculated risk. We'll take it. We'll accept some influence from the Soviets, but we think we can get away with it. They were looking to countries like Finland. I mean, it's weird today to think about like Finland and Afghanistan in the same box, but Finland, they had very close relationship with the Soviet Union for a long time, and managed to avoid kind of being flipped, as it were, into communist into communism. But basically, because of that, this decade of Dawood in the 1950s, until he gets kicked out by the king because he's too gung-ho about the conflict with Pakistan in the early 60s, it has two legacies, right? The one legacy is that he promoted a lot of economic development, he promoted education, and all these things continue afterwards as well, partly also by kind of by playing off the Soviet Union and the United States against each other. Right, so the Americans were, you can read it in the American newspapers in the 1950s. I mean, it's not like the biggest news, but they're saying, oh, we're a little bit worried about Afghanistan. Maybe they're turning communist. Maybe they're going to the Reds. Maybe we should do something about it. And Americans in Afghanistan were writing, we need to give more aid. We need to build close relationships because, otherwise they'll kind of fall under. They'll be gone on the other side of the Iron Curtain, right? So this
Dawood was very clever. Dawood was very clever.
Yeah, absolutely. It was very clever, but maybe in the end he was too clever, right? So he said, I like to light my American cigarettes with
Russian matches.
With Russian matches, right? But in the end he ended up lighting all Afghanistan on fire with those matches. I mean, because of course what happens is during the 1960s he gets kicked out. Zahir Shah, who, again, progressive liberal, he promotes a kind of a constitutional monarchy with an elected parliament as a model. Again, he looks to countries like Britain, where you have a similar system. We have a king, but the king kind of sits in the background. And he was, Zahir was, to his credit, never a power-hungry person. I mean, he was kind of not interested in being, amassing power for himself. In a way, he was very conscious of his role as a kind of symbol, of a national symbol, but he wanted Afghanistan to be the policy to be more democratic.
He was willing to devolve the powers.
Absolutely. I mean, he when he became king at 19, he had probably imagined that he would be, a poet or an intellectual, or he was not interested in it, right? He was not thinking about politics. He was not thinking about power. In some ways, that is what you want from a ruler, right? Someone who wants the best for their people, but is not interested in kind of amassing power for themselves. But maybe the flip side of that is maybe he was too complacent and let too many things kind of happen without kind of keeping the ship tight in a way. Because what happens during the 1960s is he starts this democratic process. He's worried about political parties, that they will create factionalism. So you have this democracy without parties, which sounds great, but the problem with this, it's very difficult to get a stable government. Typically, you need one party that can kind of get together and decide on who they want to be ministers, and they have a clear majority, and they can create policies. So from 1964 until 1973, you have, I think, something like 5 or 6 prime ministers. It's very unstable. I mean, that's not unusual for an early stage democracy. I mean, Norway would be the same in that same period. I mean, or in the same stage of its democracy, which was a few decades earlier, right? And an early democracy is unstable almost by definition. But what happens is, in about 10 years in, is that his cousin comes back, Dawood, and Dawood had been excluded from the possibility of running for election in the constitution. It was a move that Dawood, and maybe he was right, thought that was a sort of specifically targeted at him, because I think Zahir thought, he's so popular, he'll just win, and then we'll go back to just being the royal family ruling everything. He kicks Zahir out with a coup. Zahir was in Europe at the time. Maybe he was traveling too much to Europe, but he was having a dental appointment or something like that, and then he basically abdicated. He said, "I'm not going to fight you. I'm not going to, I'm not going to." He probably could have at that point, mounted resistance and tried to kind of hold on to power, but he was like,
but that could have led to a civil war.
Exactly, and it's very strange. Almost when you read the kind of declaration, he sort of says, this is probably the will of the people, and I'll let you handle it, and it's almost like a sigh of relief, because I think at that point also he had struggled to make the reforms work, and again, I mean, it's easy to misinterpret that. I think is kind of saying, well, democracy would never work there, but I mean, that was the same in every, in Germany, in Italy, in Norway, wherever you go. I mean, the first 10 years of a democracy is extremely difficult. It's probably the same thing in Pakistan. But
for us, 70 years have been very difficult and very.
Oh, fair enough. But obviously when Dawood comes back, he comes back with the backing of military officers who are many of whom are actually communists, or kind of, so the Communist Party at that point had two things that happened at this point ideologically in Afghanistan. There's obviously there's quite a few military officers who are communists. That's very, very important. There's quite a few intellectuals and academics and whatever that are communists. Again, as elsewhere, right? This would have been the same in Paris and in Oslo. I mean, if you went to the University of Oslo in 1975, there would have been Maoists and Leninists and whatever, same thing in Pakistan, whatever. But also you had at the same universities in Kabul as you had development of communists, you had these radical Islamists.
Theological department was set up.
Exactly. It's very, and I think often this kind of movement of this kind of radical Islamists is kind of mistaken. It's mixed up with traditionalists, with kind of the saying, oh, this is kind of rural traditionalists, whatever. It's not the same thing. It's a very, these were
radicals are different than radical Islamists are different than the traditionalists.
Completely. In a way, they're a kind of mirror image of the communists. They want to do the same things as the communists. They want to radically reshape society. They want to have a revolution. They want to depose the king. They want to depose the parliament. They want to have a, but in this, it's just a kind of different color of it. A different content.
Two extremes.
Exactly. But even the way that the kind of activists were organized and the way they looked, I mean, it was very similar to the communists. They would even study Iranian communist propaganda. It's very good. So the hair studies and they themselves are looking to it, and even some of the important leaders, like for example, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, he denies it himself, but there are quite a few people say he originally was a communist, and then at some point during his late teens, early 20s, he kind of switched sides.
They were very educated.
Yeah.
They were very educated.
Yeah. But ideologically, this is a kind of a this material comes from from Egypt, from other academics essentially in Egypt that were developing these ideas in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and several of the professors in Kabul, again, is kind of part of this modernization in a way, right? They go on a study trip to Egypt.
Then from Jamaat-e-Islami, they were influenced.
Yeah, exactly, in Pakistan as well. Exactly. Yeah, but they come back and so some of these guys at the theological faculty, many of them become very important later. So these are people like Mojadedi, Rabbani, etc., who are professors, and later they become moderate compared to the more extreme Islamists. But they were translating, for example, the works of Said Qutb and other guys from Arabic into Farsi. And then getting around them this group of kind of students that were very excited, and typically then the students who are younger, more excitable, and have less wisdom, were more extreme than the professors, right? So these are people like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, for example, especially Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who then were kind of was very excited about revolution and violence and all these things. So after Dawood takes over in 1973, he kind of has two extreme threats. Yeah, he has the communists on one side, and he has kind of allied with, exactly, and he's allied with some of the moderate communists in the army, and then he has the extreme Islamists on the other side, and both of these have very, very little support in the Afghan population at large, but they have a kind of a strong hold in parts of the intelligentsia, and just on the communist side, not on the Islamist side, they have also a strong hold in the military. So the Islamists tried during the years of Dawood, they tried twice to have a coup, and they failed miserably. It's a complete catastrophe. No one supports them. They're kind of they're humiliated. They flee to Pakistan, and at this point, the Pakistani ISI starts to say, "Well, actually, you guys might be helpful because
you can't blame Pakistanis for that.
No,
there comes elections."
Well, I mean, at this point, right? I think the ISI saw these Islamists as quite helpful as a counterweight to kind of Dawood, who was still a kind of very excited about the territorial claims, and I think both for so they clearly built links with some of these guys, still very young, very weak, very kind of but at the same time the Islamists at this point are kind of split and they're fighting among themselves, right? So this is when, for example, Rabbani and Masood kind of form a separate Jamia, different from Hekmatyar's Hezb Islami, for example, right? These become different groups that hate each other and fight each other, for much of the next decade. But importantly, but they're kind of out of the game in Afghanistan because they have very little support. Dawood is very decisive. He just arrests a lot of them, kills a lot of them. He's quite an authoritarian guy. Maybe in some ways he can be similar to, I think he can be compared to MBS in Saudi Arabia right now. I mean, he's a modernizer. He wants to kind of bring economic and social reform, but at the same time is very authoritarian. And that was clearly the case with Dawood. He had both those sides to him. And then at the same time, but at the same time he had a communist problem, though, right? So he had allied with the kind of more moderate of the communists. They're called the Parcham faction, but and then there were more radical communists that kind of were so not interested in any cooperation whatsoever. But they were saying, whatever we're doing, it's a matter of getting a revolution as soon as possible. But when after Dawood had done his coup, he was already kind of in his mind. He was like worried because it was a bit too easy. So there's a story of Dawood in 1973 or 1974, soon after his coup. He's a bit of a brash guy, right? You can even see it in his pictures. He's like his bald is like he looks like someone who
sometimes with the glasses.
Yeah, with the glasses.
Villain type look. Gives the villain type look.
Yes, he's like no nonsense, So there's a story of him going into the mess hall, the officers' mess in Kabul, in one of the military bases, and he kind of says, guys, I'm a bit worried because when I mounted my coup, none of you resisted. So what does this mean? What does this mean if someone tries to do a coup against me? And they were saying, oh, don't worry, it's we knew it was you. We knew it was you, so we didn't want to resist. We're on your side, We'll obviously fight for you if someone else tries. But what happens is Dawood tries to kind of gradually purge his administration of the communists. It's not just in the military, but also ministers and so on. I mean, many of them were already a bit upset because they had supported them politically and thought that they would be given very high positions, and then they, instead of becoming a minister, maybe they become a deputy minister or a director of a department or something, and then gradually they get kicked out, they lose their jobs and so on. And what happens is the moderate communists then say, actually, they've been fighting with the radical communists. This is the Parcham and the Khalq factions. If you've seen Monty Python, Laugh of Brian, it's exactly like this. They hate each other more than they hate everyone else. The different shades of communists, right? But at this point, the moderates, they're kicked out of Dawood's government, and they're basically saying, well, if maybe we should go for revolution more quickly anyway. So they reunite with the other communists against Dawood. And this is important, right? Because they've been fighting each other for 10 years. This is tiny communists, on the edge of society, right? And they're arguing over which color the masthead of the communist newspaper should be, for example. I mean, it's kind of, you read it, and you kind of, you think yourself back to 1969, right? And you think these people must be crazy, right? They probably have support of 0.5% of the population. They're never ever going to be in power, and they are, backstabbing each other for who should be the deputy chair of the central committee's, whatever commission on, newspapers or something. I mean, it's bizarre, right? But then they get together, and because they have the support in the military, this becomes a very, very different situation from just a bunch of academics. So in 1978, there's a series of events where one of the main kind of ideologues in the Communist Party gets murdered. It's still unknown who did it. It could have been another communist. It could have been Dawood. It could have been the Islamists. Everyone, there's reason to kind of have suspicion for everyone. But it sparks a number of big demonstrations where there are a number of kind of inflammatory speeches by other communist leaders against Dawood's government. Because of that, he then goes on a raid, a spree. He arrests a lot of the key communist leaders, and there's a kind of a sense that maybe actually now he's done it. He's gotten rid of the communists as well. On the morning of April 27th. In 1978, the Soviet ambassador is, he's sitting outside, is waiting outside the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Kabul, trying to get a meeting with the Afghan foreign minister, because all the communist leaders have been arrested, and he knows they're probably going to get killed, right? Because they're going to get tried for treason, they're going to all get shot. Dawood is an authoritarian, and the Soviets have been backing this guy secretly for years, right? So they don't want to lose their investment, right? So and he can't get a meeting, right? Because the foreign minister, along with the rest of the cabinet, they're in the presidential palace, basically deciding, what are we going to do? What are we going to do with these communists that we've arrested? And everyone knows the answer. They're all going to get killed, right? And while they're sitting in that meeting, suddenly, the presidential palace gets attacked by communist elements in the army, who ironically have been ordered kind of out on the streets that day to celebrate the defeat of the communists. So there's this like very, very weird turn of events, right? Where then and there's a battle. I mean, a number of battles in Kabul that day. It's a bit of a kind of touch and go, and nobody knows exactly what's happening. But then it ends with Dawood and his entire family getting killed, and the communists taking control of the presidential palace and announcing, on the radio, like, okay, we've finally defeated the,
you are in charge of the ship,
etc., etc., etc. We're now gonna.
You are the captains of the ship now.
Exactly. Finally, the people be in control, and they announce the creation of a revolutionary council and so on. So it's a very sort of, I mean, in a way, it's almost like a kind of Shakespearean or Greek tragedy, right? Because you have this these kind of reasonably thought through ideas of Dawood that taken a bit too far. He's a bit too intransigent. He is a bit too uncareful, perhaps. It's a bit, and then it ends up killing himself and his entire family, but also, in the end, all of Afghanistan. Because this is the spark then of basically 45 years of war, unbroken, which of course changes shape radically throughout that period, but has sort of absolutely horrifying consequences for Afghanistan, and and huge consequences for the rest of the world as well. Sorry, that was I got excited. Sorry, I'm writing about this.
You got excited for Dawood's period, especially, and then afterwards there's this Mujahideen got training, and then series of events happened where the Cold War ended, and then
Exactly.
and let's take it quickly towards the
war, because
9/11.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, what happens in the 1980s is, I think it's often underestimated how important that period is for Afghanistan, kind of shaping it. But what happens is those kind of very marginal, very small niche Islamists who had already been trying to have a revolution, since before the king was deposed, they're already in Pakistan and kind of ready to fight, right? So, and alongside them, a number of other resistance movements grow, and most of them in exile, right? And they are based in the same area that Dawood always wanted to make part of Afghanistan, in the kind of Pashtun majority area. They speak the same language. There's a lot of kind of connections of kinship and so on. And Zia welcomes them. He says, "This is great because this is a chance for me to kind of get into America's good graces by being an important ally in the Cold War."
Zia is our hero. Sorry to cut you.
The Pakistan zero or this podcast zero?
No, not podcast zero. Pakistan zero.
But he Zia and at this point General Akhtar, who's the leader of the ISI, they basically, Zia at this point, he's mounted a coup. The relationship between Pakistan and the United States is very difficult at this point, right? And he says, well, actually, if we can, they're worried for good reason, right? Suddenly they have the Soviet Union on the border, right? And everyone's worried that the Soviet Union will take one step further.
Godless people are on our borders.
Exactly. And maybe they want a warm water port, right? I mean, it's the kind of thing everyone is worried about. Whether or not that was true, maybe it was not, but who knows, right? In terms of what would have happened if it would have. So the General Akhtar, basically, he proposed to Zia, if we can support these guys, these resistance movements in Afghanistan, that are, we'll give them shelter, we'll give them weapons, we'll give them money. We can make it difficult enough for the Soviet Union to stay in Afghanistan that they won't want to take one step further. And also, we can kind of come back into the United States' good graces by providing a kind of important.
Will become relevant to the US.
Exactly. Will become
exactly. Zia's regime was getting legitimized with the help of the US.
Completely. Well, specifically because of this, right? Because prior to this, the Americans are like, what the hell? This Islamist just took control in Pakistan. He killed, the guy we used to work with. What is this, right? Like and then it comes to say, hey, I can help you, really give the Soviet Union a bloody nose and make this intervention they've done in Afghanistan an absolute hell for them. And the Americans are like, okay, well, that's interesting, right? And then the deal they do is essentially the Americans will supply weapons and money, and the ISI will kind of do all of the coordination with the Mujahideen, with the leaders, right? So and obviously this is a very fragmented resistance at this point, right? It includes everyone from Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who's the most kind of radical political Islamist, very, all the way to, kind of moderate, like people like Gailani, who was a Sufi leader, but very liberal. He ran a Peugeot car dealership. He was, he would wear a suit and was very kind of a supporter of the modernization, and every shade in between, And these are different groups. Gradually, they kind of form into 7 different groups, Sunni groups that are based in Pakistan. In addition to those, there are Shia groups that are supported by Iran. But over the next decade, there's an enormous amount of and very rapidly growing support poured towards this group through the ISI, through Pakistan, from the Americans and the Saudis. So the Saudis finance half of it. I mean, they're big players in it as well, right? And the effect of that, is that at the end of the 1980s, you've had enormous. At the end of the 1980s, these Mujahideen groups are very, very strong. In particular, the most extreme groups, because they were, groups like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's Hezb Islami, because they were much more aligned with the ideology of Zia, and also because, this depends who you ask, right? If you read the
they were expert in guerrilla warfare. They were experts in guerrilla warfare.
Yeah. But if you read the memoirs of some of the ISI guys that we're working with, they're saying, Hekmat Era's men were just the best at killing Soviet soldiers, so we gave them the most money. If you read other people, they have different reasons for it, right? They say actually, it was very helpful for Pakistan to use Hekmat Era as a proxy because he had less ties to other elites inside Afghanistan. I mean, his ties. I mean, he was an engineering student who was an Islamist activist and was then completely dependent on the ISI, right? That was his sponsor, right? So then it's a much easier kind of force to shape, as it were. Whereas a lot of these other guys, they had alternate sources of support, which made them much more difficult to kind of control. But in the end, the Americans were kind of a bit hands off. They were like, as long as Soviet soldiers keep dying, we're happy. This is great, and obviously had to, that came back to bite. That came back to bite them later on, especially as as the 80s kind of go on. The war in Afghanistan also became a kind of an international jihadi cause, right? So you have everyone from kind of basically liberals to liberal anti-communists to extreme jihadists like Osama bin Laden, who kind of make common cause against the communists.
That wasn't now constricted to Afghanistan, US, and then Russia. So that became a global war now.
Exactly. Or I would say it becomes a global cause, right? It's kind of one. It's a proxy war within the Cold War, right? And obviously it's an important tool for the Americans to create a huge amount of trouble for their main geopolitical rival, which is the Soviet Union. And I think in the aftermath, the way the Soviets waged that war, I mean, it was extraordinarily destructive. I mean, it makes the last 20 years, pale in comparison in terms of the number of deaths, in terms of the use of heavy munitions, mines, etc. So, I mean, out of the, Afghanistan had a population of about 50 million people, 14 or 15 million people in 1979. And between 1979 and 1990, about 1.5 million to 2 million people got killed. About another 1.5 to 2 million people were maimed, made invalid, unable to kind of go on with their lives in a normal way, lost a leg or an arm or whatever. And about 4 million people or 5 million people became refugees, in Pakistan and Iran. So it's half of the population of Afghanistan that is basically either displaced, killed, or maimed during this period. And it has this incredibly destabilizing effect also on all kinds of social structures and political structures, because all of their citizens are fighting against the government, right? And the government at this point, the communists, they are taking control of all the, they're saying, they're using the schools in order to indoctrinate children into communism. So that means that the Mujahideen start to attack the schools, right? And you get this, and also at the local level, right, where you maybe traditionally had elders in a village who would kind of be in charge of things. What you start to instead have this kind of young Mujahideen commanders, because they have the guns, because they have the money. They become a much more important political force at the local level. So you're kind of the consequence of this war in the 1980s is not just that you have an enormous number of people killed and displaced. I mean, half the population. It's insane, right? But it's also that you completely eviscerate the social, political, cultural structures and the traditional structures and the kind of moderate structures. I mean, both kind of moderate liberal structures and moderate traditional structures, whether you think about the city or you think about the countryside, and that's replaced with violence and with either Mujahideen commanders or with the communists, which set the stage for the kind of destabilization in the 1990s. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. No, but
so we have reached the timeline before 9/11 happens.
Yes.
Actually, we have touched upon 9/11 as well.
Yeah.
So we'll continue to have more conversation after 9/11. What happens in Afghanistan?
Yeah.
Also, how ideological wars between two world powers impacted a nation state at that time, and what consequences that have for the region, and what would happen next. Like, not we will have your views on MP Elwood's statements as well,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Uh,
Shall we
so
talk about that
thank
now,
you so
or
much.
no? Sorry.
We're going to end it,
Thank,
Stephen. Okay.
yeah,
Thank
you're
you so
right.
much
Sorry.
for your time.
Yeah. Thank you.
We'll continue to discuss this in our second episode.
Thank you. Really appreciate that,
Thank you so much
and
for
really
your
looking
time.
forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time. Bye bye.